you remember the story, the megachurch pastor, Ted Haggard from Colorado Springs. I mean, the news was riddled with the controversy of his affair with a male masseuse, and how his wife stayed. In fact, she wrote a book about it, about why she forgave him and why she stayed. Even here in Salt Lake City, there was the Tonga mom who shocked the courtroom when at the sentencing phase of her son's killer, she stood up and asked the judge to release the killer immediately. And her statement to the courtroom was, "Forgiveness is a big deal." Even a few years back, there was the Amish community that suffered their horrific school shooting, where a guy had broken into this girl's school and tied up 10 girls and eventually killed himself, but before doing so, he killed 5 girls. Before they even had the funeral, the families of these girls were already forgiving the killer and his spouse. In fact, somebody from the Amish community actually showed up at her house telling her that they had forgiven her and forgiven her husband, and they even invited her to the funerals. Back in 1981, the Pope of the Catholic Church actually, there was an assassination attempt on his life, and a few years later, Pope John Paul ended up going to that very prison to confront the guy that tried to kill him. And he forgave him. I mean, how could these people forgive? The humanity was so destroyed in all these situations, but they chose to forgive.
Matthew chapter 18, starting in verse 21. Then Peter came up to him and said, "Lord, how often will my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 70 times 7.
See, Peter here is talking about repeated forgiveness, because it's easy to forgive somebody when they do something only one time. That's pretty easy. But Peter's kind of asking this question: of all the times my brother keeps sinning against me, how many times do I have to keep forgiving him? Is 7 times good? I mean, he might actually be talking about Andrew, his brother. 90% of all resentment happens in the family. There's an old saying that says, to dwell above with the ones we love, well, that will be a glory. To dwell below with those that we know, well, that's a different story. So Jesus here is talking to Peter, and Peter's kind of showing off, saying, hey, I'll forgive him 7 times. That's good, right, Jesus? 7 times, that's good, right? Jewish law only required that Peter forgive somebody 3 times. In fact, if you read the King James Version, Jesus actually points out 3. He says, no, I'm not saying you 3, because that would have been Jewish law. He says, I'm not saying 7 like you said, but I'm saying 77 times. In other words, Jesus is saying, you keep forgiving them as many times as they need it. There is no end. In other words, if you're keeping track of how many times you have to forgive somebody, you never really forgave them in the first place. I mean, if you're keeping score on forgiveness, you never forgave them in your heart the very first time.
Therefore, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wishes to settle his accounts. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents.
So this king is settling his accounts. He's brought in people that owe him money, and this guy happens to owe him a lot of money. I mean, a lot of money. This is like an NBA-sized LeBron James contract here. And he says, it's time to pay up.
And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment was to be made.
So there's no bankruptcy back then. He can't file Chapter 7, Chapter 13. Law required that if you owed somebody money and you couldn't pay up, they could take your wife, they could take your kids, they could sell them into slavery, in fact, throw you into prison. So this was pretty normal, what's going to happen.